Welcome to Strange Familiars. Allison, you're back.
It's like I never left.
You weren't here last week. I don't even know if you knew you weren't here last week.
I was asleep. Oh, I was worried about something and I had stayed up for 30 hours straight and then
That's
I kind of crashed.
Yeah, I knew there was a reason why I was like, oh, I'm not going to wake her up.
Yeah, and I finally fell asleep after work. Yeah, that's what it was.
And it's settled. Whatever you're worried about, if in case people are worried about you worrying, it's settled.
Yeah, and it wasn't anything.
Yeah.
It was just,
Yeah, there's nothing. No, there's not. Well, I mean, there's always something.
There's always something to worry about it. Yeah.
But that
I've moved on to new things to worry about.
That particular thing is settled.
Yeah.
Last week I mentioned that zine that somebody sent me, the Vitamin D zine. It has a really nice write-up on Strange Familiars in it, and I said I didn't know if they wanted me to give out the mailing address, as the contact. So they contacted me and they said, just email steppedinpaint@gmail.com. Steppedinpaint@gmail.com if you want to talk about getting a copy of Vitamin D zine, issue 0.
Zines are always the way to our heart.
Yeah. There's something about them.
I know. And that's what we always talk about, that really podcasts were your way of kind of doing like an oral zine, an audio
zine.
Like an audio zine, yeah.
I mean, I think that's what the best podcasts are. It's the same kind of care. It's the same kind of niche interest.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same kind of DIY thing, at least independent podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
These major media companies that are pumping out podcasts.
Or celebrities that, like, every celebrity has one. I'm like, can you please just save something for the rest of us who, like, can't get by on our residuals from our multi-million-dollar movies? Like,
yeah, I know. Like
you have enough.
Yeah.
Give us some creative land where people who aren't wealthy and connected can.
They could get shows on, like, major things.
Yeah, like
why do they all have to do podcasts?
I don't know.
We were lucky enough to get in at a good time, though, and we have our audience, which we're very thankful for. On tonight's show, I'm going to be talking with Timothy Grieve-Carlson about his book, American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius.
Do you go into a little overview of who Kelpius was before we start the interview? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, throughout, we kind of bounce around, and we talk about the legendary Kelpius and the actual Kelpius. And
that was something that you brought to my attention, I want to say late 90s kind of thing, and we were really into the Kelpius thing at that point, and like we went to the Ephrata cloisters a lot because that was like, what's the connection there? I forget the
founder of the Ephrata cloister came to America to join the Kelpius group, but when he got there, Kelpius was dead, and I think there was one remaining member who kind of schooled him a little bit, and then he moved out to Ephrata and started the cloister there.
Oh, okay. I knew there was some kind of connection, and that's how we got into seeing it, which is, it's a cool place to visit.
Yeah, it really is. All right, let's go ahead and hear my talk with Timothy Grieve-Carlson. I'd like to welcome Timothy Grieve-Carlson to Strange Familiars. How are you doing tonight?
Tim, I'm doing all right. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, thanks for coming on. We're going to be talking about your book, American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius. Before we get to that, though, can you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm kind of local to Strange Familiars land. I grew up in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, so not too far.
All right.
And I've been interested in paranormal stuff for forever, basically. I did a honors thesis about kind of an anthropological comparison of like Bigfoot type legends across cultures and throughout history. Yeah, when I was an undergrad. And after that, I knew I wanted to kind of go into more sustained kind of like scholarly academic work on the paranormal. This is easier said than done. It's pretty tricky to do. So I ended up doing a PhD in religious studies down in Houston at a school called Rice University with a scholar named Jeffrey Kripal. And while I was down there, I spent some time working on what is now the Archives of the Impossible Project. So this kind of huge collection of American paranormal history, basically UFO stuff, psychical research stuff. So yeah, that's kind of been my life trajectory so far, and the path that has led me to writing this book.
Oh wow! So what do you see in the future? More books? Are you going to teach? What does the future hold?
Yeah, I'm a teacher. I teach at a little school called Westminster College outside of Pittsburgh. Yeah, that's the plan. More books. I'm working on another one right now, which is about the paranormal and ecology in a place called the Big Thicket in Southeast Texas,
Oh,
near where I used to live in Houston. Yeah.
I've heard of it. I've heard of it for sure.
Oh, cool. Yeah,
Lots of
very cool.
lots of Bigfoot stuff in there.
Definitely. Yeah.
So this book, American Aurora, it's on Johannes Kelpius, who is at this point a figure of legend as much as reality. In fact, most of I think what I knew about him was probably came from the legend. I'll put "no" in quotes before reading your book. So it was really, really neat to actually get as much as possible a good biography of him and a true account of his life, which it seems there was no shortage of interesting and potentially paranormal things as well.
Yeah. Kelpius's life is super interesting because on the one hand, the basic biographical details of his life are pretty straightforward, and yet he really has become, as you said, this figure of enormous legend. The way I put it in the book is just enormously influential but comprehensively misunderstood, basically.
Yeah.
And in part, the reason for this, I think, is that Kelpius is sort of lives and dies at this kind of historical juncture just before what historians and philosophers call the Enlightenment really takes hold. So he's kind of one of the last of a generation of people for whom things like alchemy, astrology, what we might just call magic, esotericism, are still pretty live intellectual topics, both in philosophy and in Protestant Christianity. And so Kelpius dies, a few years go by, we get to 1720, 1730, and when intellectuals start looking at the life and legacy of Kelpius, so first of all, they know that he's an educated person, he has advanced degrees, but he's also writing about astrology, writing about alchemy, and also writing about things that in the 19th and 20th century, as you said, we would just call straight up paranormal, right? He's writing about apparitions, kind of visionary phenomena, all in a sort of a Christian context of kind of like the supernatural and miracles. Kelpius also, I think, in a 1699 letter, actually describes what might be the very first mention of what would later be called telepathy anywhere, I think. He describes Christian mystics who can kind of feel the thoughts of other and understand the thoughts of other people in the room, even people they don't know. So this is super interesting, especially kind of within the trajectory of how what eventually kind of became the paranormal today kind of left the Christian imagination and kind of became more of a secular social phenomena in the 19th and 20th century.
Yeah. One of the projects I'm working on, and this will be, sometime vastly in the future, and I don't know if this is going to be a book or like a sort of mini series podcast kind of thing or what, is looking at a particular set of Marian apparitions, but looking at them from a paranormal perspective. And the kind of things that were happening around them sound like a lot of the stuff that was happening to Kelpius and the Pietists.
I think so, yeah. A few people who have read this book or I've kind of talked to about this research project have said in so many words, like, this all sounds really Catholic. And of course, Kelpius and his colleagues were not Catholic. They were Lutheran Protestants. But yeah, I think in part following the Protestant Reformation, Protestant Christians are they're left with the Bible, but a lot of the kind of devotional patterns of life, kind of devotion to the saints, and also the lived reality of miracles, which is pretty central to Catholic belief and practice, are suddenly kind of deleted from Christian life for Protestants. And this is actually really difficult for a lot of Protestants. One historian of the 17th century calls it the crisis of piety, for Protestants, because the basic kind of structure of Christian belief is there, but none of the actual patterns of devotional life, or again, the kind of like lived sacred reality of the miraculous is there for Protestants. So Kelpius and colleagues, they certainly would not describe themselves as like recovering a Catholic style of Christianity, but just the fact that they basically live like monks and pay very close attention to miracles just sort of begs that comparison. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Of course, Marian apparitions and their analogs with the modern UFO phenomena are just, it's just sort of impossible to ignore how parallel some of those things are.
Absolutely. So just for our listeners who may not know anything about Johannes Kelpius, can you just kind of give us a basic, who was he, when was he around, and when did he pass?
Absolutely, yeah. Kelpius is born in 1667 in what is now Romania, and Transylvania specifically. He's born into a fairly well-to-do country family. Eventually, his mother and father both die while he's young, and some local nobles from a nearby city sponsor his education, and he's able to travel to Germany to receive university training in theology, which would have been a big honor for someone at the time. During this exact period, new and very pious and enthusiastic forms of Christianity were kind of sweeping the countryside in Germany. What makes these forms of Protestantism kind of unique, kind of interesting historically, is how strongly influenced they were by basically esoteric ideas. Again, mostly through the writings of a Swiss alchemist named Paracelsus, whose ideas were very, very popular in early modern Europe, especially among early modern Protestants. Kelpius becomes kind of wrapped up in this new form of Christian devotion called Pietism. At this stage in Pietist history, Pietism is still very controversial. It's very anti-authoritarian. It's very devotional. Honestly, if you're a late 17th century Protestant, Pietism is kind of like, it's a little bit punk rock, to be honest. I mean, people are going to jail. People are getting in trouble. The like authority of the spiritual experience of the individual is really the most important thing in Pietist practice. And all of this is very new and weird for Protestants. It's popular, but the authorities don't really like it. Again, in part because Pietists are kind of engaging openly with basically esoteric, and today we would just use the word occult ideas. So again, things like alchemy, things like astrology. And so Kelpius receives his PhD in theology, and we have to kind of piece his life trajectory together, because nowhere in his writings does he kind of like tell the story of this period clearly, how he became wrapped up in Pietism. He does. He becomes wrapped up in Pietism, and he leaves us one hint in a 1699 letter. This is much, much later. This is much later in his life. A correspondent asks him to explain what Pietism is and where it came from. And Kelpius gives this response where he says, for many university students in Germany at the time, participation in Pietism led them to witness, and this is the exact phrase he uses, strange things of the invisible worlds. So one of the very interesting things about Pietism during this period, Pietists would gather, again, this was kind of secret. You could get in trouble for this. So they would gather in private homes for like religious worship services. These were called conventicle services. And what's really interesting about these conventicle services is there were just reports of what we would now call kind of outright miraculous phenomena. Things like levitations, things like apparitions, things like people hearing voices, things like Kelpius uses the phrases, ecstasies, illuminations, transfigurations of bodies. And this part is also where he describes people who could communicate the thoughts of other people or understand the thoughts of people, what we would now just simply call telepathy. And Kelpius simply says, in describing Pietism to this colleague, he says, some people saw strange things of the invisible worlds. And he later compares it to the biblical book, the Acts of the Apostles, in which, of course, the 12 apostles of Jesus, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, begin to witness kind of the gifts of the Holy Spirit directly in very kind of active, miraculous phenomena all around them. And this is the only thing that Kelpius can compare this period of his life to, the events of Acts of the Apostles. So whatever it was like firsthand, it must have been extremely dramatic for him. It must have been deeply affecting. And we know it was because he says as much in this letter, but also at this point, he breaks away from what could have been a pretty cushy, nice gig as a university professor or a preacher. Again, he has a PhD. This is not easy to do. And he becomes affiliated with some of the most radical pietists in Europe at the time, figures who are so radical, one in particular named Johann Jakob Zimmermann, who are under kind of direct threat of imprisonment or execution. And so Kelpius and this group of about 40 people make plans to travel to what at the time was the only place in the world where the state did not reserve the right to execute you for believing something strange, Pennsylvania. And so they end up in Pennsylvania by 1694. Kelpius's colleague who he traveled with, Zimmermann, actually dies right before they leave Europe. He dies really abruptly. They left Germany. They make it as far as Amsterdam before Zimmermann suddenly dies from some unknown condition. We don't know how he died. But Zimmermann, in his writings, did predict that something terrible would happen in the year 1693. This particular prediction of Zimmermann's has led many, many historians and almost everyone who writes about Johannes Kelpius to say that Kelpius was typically they use the phrase doomsday prophet, or someone who thought the world was going to end like tomorrow. And this is not true, at least any more so than any other Christian. Of course, Kelpius in his writings evinces the belief that Christ's return is imminent. But as I try to explain, this is the case for almost every Christian since Paul believes in the imminence of Christ's return, right? Yeah. So Kelpius is not terribly unique in this way. And he certainly was not a doomsday prophet any more so than any other Christian could be called a doomsday prophet. But this is sort of where that factoid in his life comes from. Kelpius makes it to Philadelphia with, again, this group of about 40 colleagues. And then he, with the exact number is not certain, but with a few kind of close colleagues, he moves outside of the city, outside of the nearby town of Germantown, and basically lives in a small cottage with a group of other really devout, pietist Christians who just want to commit themselves wholly to religious life. There's a small group of them. They live together kind of on this huge ridge overlooking Germantown, the Wissahickon River. For any listeners who are kind of local to the Philly area today, Wissahickon Valley Park is what we're talking about. It's right outside the city. It's pretty accessible, and it's actually a gorgeous little city park. You can go check out the exact place where Kelpius and company lived. So this is where their legend starts to grow, right? Again, because these individuals, even in a place like Pennsylvania, where in the 17th century especially, this was kind of like basically like an incubator for religious radicals. Like I said, if you believed something strange, Pennsylvania was a place that was safe for you to go. Mm-hmm. This was the case for a very, very long time. But Kelpius stood out as kind of one German historian writing about Kelpius just a couple decades after he died called him the strange one among strange ones, because he just was sort of unusual. He wore a coarse kind of hair shirt. This is sort of, we don't really have any kind of modern corollary for this, but some Christian monks and monastic figures will wear a purposefully rough garment to sort of make themselves continuously uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Kelpius probably did other kinds of kind of ascetic religious behaviors. Of course, he did. He lived in this very kind of austere, stark cottage that has been called kind of like a very monastic situation, living with a small number of other religious colleagues on the ridge. And we can imagine how this legend would have grown about these strange people living outside the city. Kelpius dies in 1707. He also dies fairly suddenly. He was probably never like a physically strapping or super vigorous person. Almost all of his letters describe dealing with different kinds of illnesses throughout his life. And in 1707, he eventually does succumb to a condition and he does die. But what he leaves behind are a journal of his travels from Germany to Philadelphia, about 10 written letters of his correspondence where he really kind of details his religious worldview, and a ton of songs and poetry, kind of detailing his own sort of personal sense of his mystical relationship to Jesus and his kind of idea of Christian life. A few really, I think, kind of salient and interesting things about Kelpius's personal religiosity. Kelpius lived and died during a period that historians now recognize as, we call it the Little Ice Age. This was a period at the end of the 17th century where in the Northern Hemisphere, for reasons that climate scientists and historians still aren't totally certain of, the global temperature plunged by about 2 degrees Celsius for a few decades. 2 degrees doesn't seem that bad, right? But if we remember, of course, the kind of our big goal of these are aggregate measurements that really represent colossal local effects.
Mm-hmm.
Our big goal coming out of the Paris Agreement was to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius,
Right.
understanding that anything above 1.5 would probably be catastrophic.
Right.
We're talking about 2 degrees Celsius drop for a few decades, and the result in Europe is just catastrophe. Historians are starting to spell this out today, but really I think that this was a huge part of not only Kelpius's kind of religious imagination, but also the religious imagination of a lot of other people who he was influenced by at the time. And we can see this in his religious writing. In particular, I'll go as deep into the weeds as you'd like me to, but in one letter where he gives us his most detailed and kind of succinct explanation of his theology, he calls it the threefold wilderness state, where he sort of describes the natural world, his environment, as a medium or kind of interface for his relationship with divinity, and kind of the site of his own personal transformation from what he would call kind of an unredeemed human condition into a Christian reunited with God. For him, escalating stages of identification with and contemplation of the environment are a crucially important part of Christian life and practice. And we can see this throughout his writing, and I really think it was influenced by the climatic conditions of his time. As you noted already, Tim, after he dies, his legend just kind of explodes, right? People in Philadelphia specifically, but throughout Eastern Pennsylvania, find this character, this interesting, weird, he's often painted as kind of a freaky, bizarre doomsday prophet, monk on the ridge. Many, many stories are told about him. He's actually, as I outline in the book, he's the subject of one of the first major novels written in the United States, Charles Brockden Brown's Wieland. And he makes a few appearances in some of the most popular poems written in the 19th century in America. So Kelpius, despite being, like I said, mostly misunderstood, he remains influential not only in American religion, but in American literature for a very long time, right up until the present day. As you noted, I'm not sure what you had looked at before reading this book, Tim, but Kelpius, he pops up in a bunch of different sources. I actually think that the first place that I read about Kelpius, this would have been, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago now, was the Weird Pennsylvania book. Do you know this one?
Yeah. I've got an article in it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, really? Okay, cool. Yeah, there's a page about the monks on the ridge and Kelpius, the doomsday prophet, in that book. So he's all over the place.
Yeah, I seem to remember years and years ago, just this, and I don't remember, it was probably like some fanzine or something, but this reference to this group, this cult of doomsday prophets outside of Philadelphia, looking through telescopes for the end of the world, for signs of the end of the world. And that's how I became familiar with them, that legend.
Really? Yeah. That's cool. Yeah, I'd love to see that zine. I've found a few things like that in my research. Kind of a zine would be awesome to see, but yeah, pamphlets and kind of different takes on Kelpius and who he was. And you mentioned telescopes, so I will just add really quickly. Kelpius was especially interested in what he calls the phenomena of the sky, right? So in particular, things like comets, meteors, but all kinds of what we would call today just sort of strange aerial phenomena were of severe religious interest to him in particular, and a lot of his close friends and colleagues. In the novel Wieland by Charles Brockden Brown, which came out decades after Kelpius's death, but I think was strongly influenced by the memory and kind of legacy of Kelpius, a character based on Kelpius is actually killed by what is described as kind of a luminous column of light that comes out of the sky. This is a novel written in 1798. So even as he's sort of obsessed with strange aerial phenomena, it seems like the memory of his interest in these things kind of follows his legacy throughout American literature long before we have any kind of cultural language for talking about things like UFOs.
Yeah.
Right. So again, we sort of see a whole bunch of different strands of things that would become the paranormal in the life and legacy of this guy.
In the book, you contrast these two sightings or descriptions of what may or may not be comets, separated by a few short years, one sort of like pre-enlightenment and one post-enlightenment, which I found very, very interesting. Can you kind of talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, so I opened the book with this kind of vignette, which is really illustrative of the period in history that Kelpius lives on the precipice of, and I think this historical break or this moment, to sound a little bit historian-y, the scholar Dr. Hanegraaff calls it the epistemic rupture of the Enlightenment, just kind of this punctual break in our way of thinking. The first event I describe is, to me, what seems like almost like a fairly modern sounding UFO account
it does.
From the 19th century in Philadelphia, in which this enormous luminous object rises up from the forest, basically by the Schuylkill. It floats over the city. Its motion is described as kind of sputtering or wavering. If you've read a lot of UFO reports, that will sound familiar. The kind of classic falling leaf motion. It's described as kind of shedding sparkles as it moves. It eventually crosses over the city, crosses the Delaware River, and then descends somewhere in New Jersey, I suppose, descends into the woods and kind of backlights the forest. And what's really interesting about this account is the newspaper authors at the time describe it as a really unusual meteor. And that's kind of all they say about it. They don't really have any sort of sense of, well, wait, what was it actually? Or what does this mean? Or should we be reading into this more closely? It is just kind of for all the kind of mysterious beauty of this object, it's only ever an object, right? It's only ever a meteor. A few decades before that, I describe a very similar event, which I think actually probably was just a comet in the normal kind of astronomical sense. A comet that appears in eastern Pennsylvania in the 18th century. And the author of this short kind of piece of manuscript art about it, he writes, and I don't know if I can quote it verbatim exactly, the author's name is Daniel Schumacher. He writes, a comet star of a very pale colored appeared over the skies of Pennsylvania. And he says, you people ask yourselves what this may mean. And so the huge thing that stands out to me here is the appearance of this comet, of this, again, anomalous object of light in the sky, calls for something entirely different than it would decades later, when it's just a kind of poorly understood natural object. For people living in previous decades, the comet calls for this kind of introspective moral process. Ask yourself what this star may mean, right? That's actually kind of an amazing question to ask yourself of an anomalous natural phenomenon.
Oh, yes.
The author goes on to say, perhaps God wants to punish us, right? Perhaps this, that, or the other thing might be happening. But the reason I open the book with those two kind of contrasting approaches to very similar events, anomalous lights in the sky, is that is kind of the basic epistemic rupture that happens in the Enlightenment, where prior to this, natural phenomena of all kinds, but in particular, extraordinary, miraculous, apparently paranormal kind of phenomena, were matters of deep personal introspection, and I would just call them like wells of meaning, right? When things like that happen, people paid close attention to them because they understood themselves to be part of a cosmos that communicated with them in these ways, right? And when extraordinary things happened, something was trying to communicate. This is a pretty general sense of the meaning of extraordinary events before, again, the Enlightenment. After, again, ballpark 18th century, this sense of the world as an entity of which we are abundantly a part, communicating with us regularly through extraordinary phenomena, it becomes so unfashionable that it's basically incomprehensible, right? Most people don't even really have general awareness that this used to be kind of the basic way people understood themselves and their place in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a huge kind of rupture that happens. And those two particular stories, I think, illustrate it quite nicely. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It becomes, I mean, you can read it in the literature, even in the newspaper articles from the day, which, I'm collecting various old newspaper articles that talk about weird stuff. There is a turn and it becomes ridiculed. Anything like that.
Yeah.
It just becomes a point of ridicule. And that is a quick way to turn people from thinking about it or even admitting they've seen it.
Definitely, yeah. This exact moment too is kind of the rise of. When I say this exact moment, I mean we actually can date it fairly precisely. The historian of alchemy, Lawrence Princip, has said that it's right around 1720 and 1730 that alchemy really becomes out of vogue in scientific literature. And then in the decades after that, we start to get this kind of Enlightenment reaction to a lot of this stuff that will specifically use words like superstition, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And again, stuff like superstition it's never neutral, right? It's often women who are accused of it. It's often poor people. It's often people in all kinds of positions of marginalization and powerlessness who are accused of superstition. And superstition is an accusation. It's kind of interesting because it's not just saying that someone is stupid. It's not just saying that someone does not have access to the right kinds of information. It's saying that someone's way of thinking is wrong, right? Or busted, and they're foolish for it, and it makes them worse, right? So it's really not a neutral accusation that comes up at this point with superstition. But yeah, it really takes hold, and that's kind of the place we find ourselves in now to this day.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I was talking with someone earlier about this, and the thing about Newtonian physics is it works. Gravity's real.
Yeah.
It works. You can repeat these experiments in a lab. You can do them again and again. And this other stuff we're talking about, you can't bring it into a lab. Other than some very, very interesting psi experiments they've done. Certainly there's been some stuff. But for the most part, if you see a giant fireball rise up in Indiana, as I did,
For sure.
You're there and you see it. And thankfully there were two people with me. Other than that, that's it. I can't repeat that. I can't make it happen again. Yeah.
No. Yeah, that's amazing, Tim. And so like two things to say about that. The first, the Newton example is obviously really good, but also has this interesting little like virus in it. So you're absolutely right. Of course, Newtonian gravity is obviously real and reliable and works, but physicists don't actually know how it works. Like gravity still has a few kind of questions surrounding it. And I guess this would have been right after Newton published the first edition of Principia, the German philosopher Leibniz actually published a kind of critique of Newton in which he said, Newton's gravity, we don't actually know and this is a little bit technical, but when one object attracts another, we still don't understand the mechanism of that attraction. And Leibniz's problem with that is Newton, who was very interested in alchemy and astrology, is kind of injecting a little bit of magic and kind of spooky power into physics.
Interesting.
And we should all take a beat and kind of figure out how gravity works before we get on the Newton train. And this was kind of Leibniz's problem with it. So you're absolutely right. Obviously, gravity works, but throughout the history of science, there's a lot of little spooky details like that, right? That you don't really hear in your high school physics class. About the fireball, I know exactly what you mean. And so I kind of, in the book, I developed this idea of paranormal phenomena as, I call it environmental knowledge, right? And I kind of tie this into what we were just talking about with superstition. The kinds of people who see things like that are often country people, people who spend a lot of time outside, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who thus kind of, especially in this period, right? I'm not talking about people today. I'm talking about the 18th century, that lacked access to formal education, right? They certainly did not have access to kind of the cutting edge institutions of science and philosophy. And so for this reason, meteors specifically were not accepted by science until well into the 19th century.
Huh.
For this exact reason, there are scientific articles from the period saying like this meteor stuff is superstition,
Wow.
right? Because it relies on kind of the slow, local, observational knowledge that you can't reproduce in a lab that we have from country people, basically. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're exactly right. Seeing a fireball in Indiana sounds amazing, but you're right. It's not the kind of thing that there's something experiential about it
Absolutely.
that we cannot reliably, mechanically reproduce in a lab.
Absolutely. And let me tell you, the three of us were, and still are in a way, it was a more intense way at first, but less so now, but still are in a way, sort of wrestling like, what does this mean? Like, why did we see this? We had to be at that place at that time to see it. Were we there at 1 in a million chance, or is there something else to it? It's something we have to kind of work through, I guess, and probably never know the answer to.
Yeah, and this is something that the more and more I research and work on and kind of study the history of paranormal phenomena and paranormal phenomena today, it is this kind of, the reliable thing about these phenomena is how intensely meaningful they are for the witnesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's actually a huge part of what makes what we call paranormal phenomena today paranormal. It's not just like the kind of cultural wastebasket of stuff that is either not real or science hasn't figured it out yet, but it's kind of a class of phenomena that is both experiential but also personal in a very subjective way, and deeply connects ourselves to the world and our place in it, and often reveals its meaning in a very kind of gradual and almost dreamlike way, mm-hmm. right? Sometimes a dream the day after doesn't make sense, and then like a month later it really makes sense.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
It's kind of, paranormal phenomena are kind of almost like Freudian dreams in real life in a lot of cases. At least it seems to me.
Yeah. I might say Jungian, but okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So stepping back to Kelpius, when he first comes to Pennsylvania, he's not exactly a hermit. He kind of does, he and his group kind of involve themselves. They're teaching. They're sort of involved in some controversy with the Quakers and so forth.
Mm-hmm. It seems like they had plans to really involve themselves in kind of communal society in Philadelphia. The radical pietists at the time were, in Germany, were very involved in education and charitable projects and taking care of poor people. And they wanted to set up this kind of thing in Pennsylvania for reasons that are never detailed in at least any of the primary sources. This never really pans out. Kelpius and a few colleagues definitely ran a small school on the ridge. We know this because decades later, a few people mentioned having gone to school there and other kind of historical sources. Mm-hmm. And I just think this suggests like such a kind of interesting and weird scene from these children in Philadelphia climbing the ridge to learn, math and physics and divinity from these men wearing these kind of monastic costumes, living in this cottage. It must have been a kind of a funny situation. But yeah, they definitely tried to set up some kind of educational or public service program. So they arrive in 1694. By the time we get to 1702, one of Kelpius's close friends and colleagues, a man named Daniel Faulkner, writes a letter back to pietists in Germany, and he says the school hasn't really gotten off the ground. And he doesn't use Kelpius's name, but he says some people that should be really involved in it have turned themselves kind of entirely over to spiritual and heavenly things. And Daniel Faulkner is he's a little bit frustrated when he's saying that. So I get the sense that really throughout this period, Kelpius's religious commitments and really his ascetic behavior, his monastic behavior, deepened and deepened and deepened during this period. And he kind of turned gradually away from the public and became much more the kind of really private, solitary hermit alone on the ridge. To mention the conflict with the Quakers, yeah, as soon as they arrived in Philadelphia, again, 1694, not Kelpius himself, but people affiliated with him immediately involved themselves in this kind of conflict within Quakers in Philadelphia related to the accusations of a Philadelphia Quaker named George Keith, who basically accused the Philadelphia Quaker community of kind of turning away from what he considered a personal relationship with Jesus and biblical theology and kind of leaning in entirely to just the inner light, just that kind of spiritual intuition that Quakers rely on. From Keith's perspective, Quakers were kind of slipping away from what made them Christians and slipping into this new kind of spiritual autonomy of the individual. And Keith really had a problem with this. A few of Kelpius's friends really had a problem with this too, and they immediately side with Keith, but they involved themselves on the losing side of this controversy. So Keith's critique never really picks up that much steam. He's expelled from the Philadelphia Quaker meeting, and it seems like almost immediately Kelpius's group, with particularly the really kind of powerful and influential Quakers in Philadelphia, they are no longer considered cool kids. And there's kind of this permanent social rupture between this new group of pietists and the Quakers in Philadelphia. So even in a place like Philadelphia, where really, like I said, one of the major points of the colony existing was that so people can kind of believe what they like to and not be bothered for it. These sorts of religious controversies were not uncommon.
In the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I get a sense of a real struggle to sort out fact from fiction on your part as you're going through his life.
Yeah, this was the main challenge of the book. And this was kind of like one of the animating things that made the book interesting and worthwhile to write. That a lot of what, let's say if you Google the name Johannes Kelpius today, a lot of the stuff that will come up is just not true, has no real basis in any kind of historical reality. The reason for that can really be boiled down to one book written in 1895 by a just kind of enthusiastic antiquarian historian named Julius Saxa, who, in addition to, he was just a sort of passionate local man who really loved local history, and he preserved a lot of primary material. He wrote a lot of things down and preserved a lot of things that were real and true, and he also just made stuff up. And in particular, he really got it in his head and really loved the idea that Kelpius was part of a kind of a secret society. At this time, 1895, this is one of the first times in sort of like modern transatlantic history when secret societies and also kind of conspiracy theories about secret societies are kind of in vogue.
Oh, yeah.
There's kind of widespread cultural interest in Freemasons, and not just among Freemasons, right? Kind of people who are not Masons are kind of really asking what these people are up to. And Saxa thinks that Kelpius was part of kind of a secret mystical fraternity. He called them Rosicrucians. Of course, Rosicrucian is a word that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But Saxa really believed that Kelpius was part of this secret mystical society. And this really influenced his ideas about Kelpius and his writing about Kelpius in a way that Kelpius's memory has never really recovered from. So again, a lot of this doomsday prophet stuff comes from Saxa. A lot of this stuff about Kelpius being directly connected in this religious lineage, kind of going back to other occult figures in Europe, comes from Saxa. But a lot of that stuff I think scholars could forgive, but the place where Saxa's work really runs aground is he kind of makes stuff up in his sources. So he will insert Kelpius's name into sources where Kelpius's name isn't mentioned, stuff like that, things that really kind of distort his memory. And so believe it or not, Sachs's book is still the most widely used and cited kind of secondary source about Kelpius. It's still the main resource that most people go to for information about his life. And this has kind of made the historical situation almost impossible for anyone who really wants to figure out who Kelpius really was, what he really thought and did, and why he became as influential as he did. So yeah, a huge part of what I do throughout the book is I try to lay out the story that the primary sources tell. I try to tell in a straightforward way who this man was, the world he came from, why he believed what he did, why he did what he did. And then by the time the last two chapters really focus on his legacy in American religion and American literature. And that's where I get to tell the story of this legend. And by the end of the book, there are really two Kelpiuses. There's the historical Kelpius, and then there's the Kelpius of legend, who I also find super interesting. And in part because I've struggled so much with this research and with this project, I actually don't blame anyone who has gotten stuff wrong about Kelpius. He actually is, like I said, people recognized him as a strange one, even among this area that had a lot of strange people. Kelpius is a difficult historical subject to get your head around. And I certainly can appreciate how his memory, he's so unique and so strange and so special. And I feel like over the past few centuries, his memory has just kind of been left out in the rain, and it's gradually distorted. And now there really are two figures. There's the Kelpius of legend, and then there's the man who really existed, and they're both really interesting.
One of the coolest legends, and I'm not sure if I remember if you track down the origin of this particular legend, but perhaps you can speak to it a little bit, is the one that's based on sort of the Arthurian legend, where something was submerged in. Was it in the Schuylkill or in the Wissahickon? I forget which.
The Schuylkill, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Kelpius dies in 1707, and then in the 1740s, a Lutheran minister from Germany named Henry Melchior Muhlenberg comes to Philadelphia, and one of his jobs is really to kind of like whip the Pennsylvania Lutheran congregations into shape, to really kind of get them up to par, to really kind of correct the religious behavior of Lutheran Christians in the colonies. And he knows about the Kelpius community. He knows that there were these really radical, from his perspective, like wacko pietists who were briefly very influential outside of Philadelphia. And in his writing about them, he does not make a secret of the fact that he does not appreciate those guys. He says specifically their religious practice had a lot to do with alchemy, with contemplative practice, meaning I think kind of Kelpius and his the people he lived with practiced this form of kind of inner prayer is what they called it. But I think to many listeners, it would kind of just look like deep meditation, basically. And Muhlenberg really has a problem with all of this. He really does not appreciate these guys, but he interviews a few people who knew them. He interviews, for example, one very old woman who remembered going to school with the Kelpius community. And this is really interesting, and again, kind of corroborates a few other primary sources, which makes me think that woman probably did go to school with Kelpius, and that's probably a true story. And then he tells a very strange story. He says one person told him that when Kelpius was dying, when Kelpius was on his deathbed, he handed a friend of his a box, basically this small object with what inside it was something called the lapidem, right? And in later versions of this legend, people would just say, this is the philosopher's stone. This is the fabled kind of super substance that is the goal of all alchemical practice. And on his deathbed, Kelpius hands this to his friend, and he says, I want you to throw this into the Schuylkill River. And Kelpius's friend says, oh, okay, wow. And he takes it and he goes down the ridge and heads towards the Schuylkill. And at the last minute, he hesitates and he doesn't throw it in. I guess he thought it was too special. It's not something to be thrown away. And goes back up to Kelpius, and Kelpius says, I know you didn't throw it in. And then he says, you're right. And he goes back down the river. he finally throws it in, and there's this extraordinary bolt of lightning that explodes out of the river. And of course, this is straight out of the legend of King Arthur, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I actually don't know the legend super well off the top of my head, but on Arthur's deathbed, he commands one of his knights to throw his sword back into the lake where it came from, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, same exact deal. The person hesitates. He goes back. Arthur says, "I know you didn't throw it in." And then he goes back, he throws it in, and then the Lady of the Lake reaches out and reclaims the sword.
Right.
So this is a legend that it obviously comes from the legend of King Arthur, right? Regardless of what we think about alchemy or philosopher's stones or anything, this story clearly comes from someone kind of repeating the legend of King Arthur. And I think it's an indication of just how Kelpius was just the kind of person that people wanted to tell stories about, right? And so when Muhlenberg starts going around asking questions about Kelpius in Philadelphia, he gets some people who give him really straightforward, matter-of-fact accounts. Yeah, I went to school with that guy. And he gets some stories that are just straight up fantastic fabulations, weaving the life of Kelpius and the life of King Arthur together. And so, yeah, like I said, it seems like immediately, and the decades after Kelpius's death, he just became this kind of legendary figure in the city and then gradually kind of throughout eastern Pennsylvania.
And that legend gets repeated through several sources, doesn't it? That the one about throwing the object in the river.
That's right, it does. So in the original manuscript source from Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, he doesn't identify Kelpius by name, but it's kind of clear he's talking about Kelpius. Later, in a few different sources, Kelpius's name is just inserted. So we can kind of see the legend growing gradually. By the time, so in the 19th and early 20th century, we get some pretty amazing kind of twists on this legend where one woman in particular claims to have actually recovered the Philosopher's Stone from the bottom of the Schuylkill River. And we get a bunch of different versions of this story. And I just kind of love the idea that, not only is the Philosopher's Stone real, but it's on the bottom of the Schuylkill River right now. You can go look for it. That's a pretty awesome little legend for Philly.
Oh, yeah. I often hear about Kelpius and the Society of the Woman in the Wilderness. Was that a later name sort of assigned to the group, or would they have gone by that name?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in a lot of the secondary literature, people claim that Kelpius's group referred to themselves as the woman in the wilderness. So just a little bit about what this means, the woman in the wilderness. In the biblical book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John, chapter 12, we get to this part where in John's kind of apocalyptic revelatory vision, he sees a woman clothed with the sun who is hidden by God in a wilderness location to keep her safe from the dragon, the monstrous dragon of the book of Revelation. Kelpius really identifies with this moment in Revelation of kind of wilderness as being a place of safety, of hiddenness, and of kind of special connection with God and protection from outside evil. Kelpius refers to the woman in the wilderness of of Revelation 12 throughout his writing in a bunch of different places. This is a really important and meaningful part of the Bible for him. In later sources, people say that this group was called the woman in the wilderness. This is one area where I'm actually just not certain if they did or not. Kelpius definitely identified strongly with the woman in the wilderness, so much so that in a lot of his writing, he will kind of bring it up unprompted and without really explaining what he's talking about, which gives me the sense that his regular correspondents really knew what he was talking about and knew what he meant when he would bring it up. So this was definitely something that he talked about a lot, but it's not clear to me if they were called the woman in the wilderness. But I think this is kind of one of the legends that really does seem to be backed up by the primary sources, and it wouldn't surprise me if they did. Kelpius's identification with this female figure is also super interesting. Kelpius wrote a lot of religious poetry, and a lot of it was about his desire to reunite with Christ in a way in which he kind of assumed the role of kind of the bride in
Right.
this mystical marriage.
Yeah.
This can kind of strike our contemporary ears today as being like a really strange way to talk about one's personal relationship with Jesus. It actually was pretty common throughout the history of Christianity to sort of see the relationship between God and the human being as a kind of marriage in which human beings were the bride. Kelpius does take this, I think, a little bit farther than many. He has a few poems that are just frankly pretty erotic about his relationship with Jesus. And yeah, so again, this is sort of, he's the strange one among strange ones.
A lot
and
of
his identification with women was really consistent, basically.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of groups kind of claim Kelpius as a sort of spiritual forefather, including different Rosicrucian groups. But I think probably the one that might have the best case for it might be the Ephrata group.
Yeah.
And
yeah, certainly.
So their founder came over and looked to join Kelpius.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Ephrata, for people who don't know, was a much bigger, and I think probably more influential than Kelpius, monastic society of radical pietists in the 18th century who settled in, of course, what is now Ephrata, Pennsylvania, and I believe Lancaster County. Mm-hmm. And the founder, Conrad Beissel, traveled to Pennsylvania in, I believe it was 1720, specifically to try to join Kelpius. He wanted to, in his words, kind of apprentice himself to Kelpius, to live with the monks on the ridge. Of course, at this point, Kelpius had been dead for a little more than 10 years. So this tells me two kind of interesting things. First of all, that a lot of people in Europe knew about Kelpius and knew about the Kelpius community, but they didn't have enough kind of granular detail for Beissel to know that Kelpius had died a little while ago. So both of those points are kind of interesting, but Beissel does connect with the surviving members of Kelpius's group, in particular a Swiss monk named Conrad Mathai, who does kind of apparently teach Beissel a lot of what the Kelpius group did and how they sort of conceived themselves as Christians, in thoroughly Protestant Christians who were doing this kind of very monastic, ascetic, unique form of Christian life. If you go to the Ephrata cloisters today, their ascetic behaviors, their kind of personal denial in order to bring themselves closer to God, is really obvious in a lot of the architecture of the buildings. I think one of the big kind of reveals, if you take a tour of the Ephrata cloister, is the wooden pillows that they put their heads on. They kind of the same thing with the coarse garment or the hair shirt. Kind of comforts were not really helpful to individual spiritual development, and so these people didn't have a lot of comforts. One practice that the Ephrata community did that I think is kind of interesting, and I personally have a hunch that probably did originate with the Kelpius group, is sky watching. And so the Ephrata monks would actually get out of bed at midnight and say prayers and watch the night sky in kind of anticipation for not only Christ's return, but also whatever might happen in the sky, right? So again, as I said, Kelpius is really interested in aerial phenomena of all kinds and unusual things in the sky. And my hunch, and of course I don't know this for sure, is that Beissel probably picked this up from people he met and spent some time with in what was left of the Kelpius group. And this is the origin of that practice at Ephrata. Ephrata really becomes a huge organization. I don't know exactly how many monks and nuns were there at its largest, but I think Kelpius's community, I would be surprised if it ever got above single digits. Ephrata was huge and really influential. And in the 18th century, they ran the only printing press in Pennsylvania other than Benjamin Franklin's printing press. So they were really extremely influential, churning out a ton of religious literature. And they are kind of the indirect, since Kelpius died before Beissel got to Pennsylvania, they're kind of the indirect sort of legacy I would say, the Kelpius community in America.
Worth visiting for anybody who's nearby or wants to take a trip there. It's beautiful. They've kept all the old buildings. It's a wonderful tour. Worth visiting after.
Yeah.
So what about the Cave of Kelpius, the so-called Cave of Kelpius that I've not visited myself, but I've seen reference to so often?
Yeah, so if you Google Kelpius, you're going to see a ton of images, what looks like kind of this little stone passageway into the earth in this hillside near the Wissahickon River outside of Philadelphia. And this cave, it's not a cave. It's as much as we can figure out about it, it is a 19th century root cellar. So pre-refrigeration technology if you want to keep your root vegetables good for a while, a root cellar, you keep them cool, keep them dry. But at some point in the 19th century, this little cellar becomes connected with the memory of Kelpius. I don't know exactly how this happened. The earliest kind of connection of this cellar with Kelpius that I can find comes from, again, Julius Saxa, the author of this 1895 book that really kind of shapes the legend of Kelpius. But it is kind of a cool little cellar in the middle of the woods. It does have this spooky kind of interesting vibe, and immediately it just becomes like the legendary site becomes Kelpius's monastic cell, right? Where he did all of his meditations, all of his prayers, conducted all of his alchemical experiments, allegedly. And so this is really kind of like the best symbol for the legendary Kelpius. Almost certainly had nothing to do with him, but it is really close to where he actually lived. It's right there. But yeah, this little cave has become kind of like the main sort of legend tripping site associated with Kelpius. And if you look up the geotag on any social media platform, Cave of Kelpius, you're going to see a ton of people exploring the cave. There's definitely been a bunch of kind of like ghost hunts and stuff done around the cave, like cool videos of stuff like that. And so it's a cool, fun, like legend tripping site for people who want to connect with this story, but it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the historical Kelpius. It's really something that has sort of come up long after he was gone.
It seems like, at least from what I could tell from your book, they were not living in caves. They had a little cottage that they were living in.
Yeah, they make mention of building a house and kind of living communally together in this house. This is the 17th century in Philadelphia, so it would not have been, no insulation, nothing like that. It would have really been a very modest cottage. Yeah.
The book, again, is called American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius by Timothy Grieve-Carlson. Guessing it's available wherever people want to pick up books?
It sure is, yeah. For an American audience, probably the easiest place to get it is Amazon. Also available from Oxford University Press. And I will be doing talk in Philadelphia in November and in Ephrata in January. And so I'll have a few books hopefully there to sell too.
Oh, fantastic. Timothy Grieve-Carlson, thank you so much for coming on Strange Familiars.
Tim, thank you so much for having me. I had a blast.
If you like Strange Familiars,
I do.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a good thing, because here you are on the mic.
Yeah.
But if the people out there like it,
yeah,
and they'd like to help us continue to make the show and get extra content besides, they can become a patron at Patreon. It's patreon.com/strangefamiliars. All of our patrons get commercial-free versions of the weekly show, as well as extra shows every month. We do at least one full extra episode of Strange Familiars for our patrons. Sometimes we do more. I keep mentioning it. I haven't had time to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But when I get time, the entry level is going to move up. Right now it's $4 a month to get that extra content on Patreon. We're going to raise it to $5 soon when I get a chunk of time to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But
so
it's
if you
coming.
keep Tim busy, things are going to be cheaper.
If you get in now, though, if you get in before we raise the rate, and as long as Patreon lets us do this, you'll be grandfathered in.
In perpetuity. When we're still doing this in 2075, you will still be paying $4 a month.
As long as you stay locked in and as long as Patreon lets us do that. We have people who became our patrons at the beginning of the podcast for $3 a month. Many of them bumped up to $4, but they don't have to. There's a lot that are still at $3 a month, and as long as they stay there and keep paying that $3 a month, they'll get the extra content every month.
That seems fair. I think, like, I hate loyalty offers which go to new people, not people that have been with you for a long time, where it's like, well, you can only get this offer if you're new.
Yeah.
I'm full of opinions tonight.
Once again, it's patreon.com/strangefamiliars. There's also an option at Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe there to a program called Patron of the Strange. And Apple Podcast subscribers also get the commercial-free weekly shows and the extra shows monthly. And I'd like to thank all of our patrons, no matter where you're signed up. You make this show happen. Thank you so much. We could not do it without you. I just want to mention Timothy Grieve-Carlson's book once more because I really loved it. It's called American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius. There's links and information in the show notes if you want to pick it up. It's on Amazon. You can order it from everywhere too. You know, to have this figure, this Johannes Kelpius figure, and I really knew more of the legend than the actual story, and then to actually read the biography. And you get both in this book. You get the legends and his actual biography. I really, really enjoyed it. So I want to thank Timothy for coming on the show. Our emails back and forth are, hi, Timothy. It's Timothy. A lot of Timothys in our emails.
Battle of the Tims.
All right, Allison.
Mm-hmm.
What have you brought us here? It rattles. Got a little ASMR thing going on here.
Yeah, here, hand it to me really quickly. Let's see. Oh, my nails aren't long enough. Maybe the sound of it opening, because it is wood. It is a very... Okay, enough soundscapes. It is pretty fun, though, and this is something I've kind of always wanted, but they usually come in a different form. They're usually little, what people would refer to probably as Russian nesting dolls, but this is like the whole world, and like sort of like this like alchemical sort of.
Oh, it's very appropriate for tonight's show.
Yeah, yeah. So you know how I like a theme, right?
It's very appropriate for Kelpius.
Look, like it's got like, is that the sign for female and male?
Yeah,
the stars, and the
stars.
The sun and the moon, female and male, is in the smallest. There are 3 interlocking.
Yeah,
spheres.
I mean, this might be the Philosopher's Stone itself.
Yeah. Okay, so the first one is a little ball that it's blue with gold, sun and moon, male and female, and that goes inside the next one, which is more of like looks like a weather-related one, which has sort of like does not look like wind or the ocean on top, and the sun on the other side.
Is it the elements? Is it earth, air, fire, and water?
That makes the most sense, actually.
Yeah, I think it's earth, air, fire, and water.
And then the last one is like sort of this apocalyptic. It's got like sort of this Vesuvius-looking volcanoes and rainbows and lightning.
Oh, it's so cool.
Yeah, isn't it? I thought.
Okay, yeah, this is so appropriate for tonight's shows. Yeah. I mean, almost even matches the cover of the book.
That's what I thought. I saw it and it reminded me. I was like, oh, I've always wanted.
This is great. Yeah. Wow. So
it's
yeah,
like
I don't even know what to call this.
It's like a nesting doll, but it's not doll. Like
yeah, it's like a nesting
egg sphere.
Nesting sphere.
A nesting sphere, if there is such a thing.
Yeah.
With the kind of like the elements and these apocalyptic
cool
kind
symbols
of symbols
on it. Yeah.
And you could take them out and have them all sitting there separately, which I think I would probably do so everything would get displayed at the same time.
It's really cool. You really brought the goods tonight, Allison.
I try. I take a week off, and then I come back.
All right. That's going to be our curiosity of the week. I'll put an image of this in the show notes. If you click on that, it'll take you to our Etsy shop where you can purchase this and other curiosities of the week, those that are left. While you're at Etsy, you're going to hear this rattle as I... Here, I'm going to hand it to you.
I'm going to keep tapping.
While you're at Etsy, you can pick up Strange Familiars t-shirts, stickers, patches, mugs, and more. We've got my books there. If you purchase them from us on Etsy, they will come signed. We've got artwork, prints, and originals. If I do the artwork for tonight's show, it should be up there on Etsy, the original. At this point, I'm still working on it, and it's got to be done tonight. So we'll see if I do the artwork or not.
You got stuff to do tomorrow, so you better get it done.
I'm going to try. And, I made, I haven't had much time to make rosaries, but I did make a paracord rosary. It's one of the ones with the antique crucifix from France. These are really, really cool. I believe they came from a monastery or something, but they're nuns' crucifixes from France, but they're antique. They're from the 1800s.
Is that what a group of nuns is? Yeah, like a murder of crows. Is it a cloister of nuns? This seems like a Brother Richard question. There's a name for those kind of words. What is it? I can't remember.
They're the collective nouns.
Oh, collective nouns. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's I made one of the rosaries using one of these antique nuns' crucifixes from France. So I think they're really, really cool.
It does appeal to what I refer to as my latent goth tendencies.
Yeah. So there's one of those up there. I'll make more. I bought a few of these antique crucifixes so I can make more. But right now there's one up there. You can check out everything at Etsy. Our shop name is Lost Grave. But if you type in Strange Familiars, you should see our stuff come up. Thanks to everybody who supports us on Etsy as well. That's another way to help us out with the show. Speaking of collective nouns.
Yes.
Do you know what the collective noun for Albatwitch is?
You made it up, so.
I did.
What is it?
It's a whistle of Albatwitch.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
There used to be like a little park near us that had, remember at Nixon Park, they had that whole thing of, would tell you all the different ones, which is where I learned a lot of them.
Do you know what, so it's a murder of crows.
Yeah.
Do you know what it is for ravens?
No, I don't think
it's
I
an unkindness.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Unkindness of ravens.
I love it because it's so poetic.
Like, they're really, really nice.
It reminds me of like something that's translated from a language which is much more romantic than ours. You know, like English doesn't have that sort of florid language.
Someone else tried to come up with the collective nouns for all the cryptids, and I didn't like it. I forget what they did for Bigfoot, but I refuse to accept we'll come up with a better collective noun for Bigfoot. But it's definitely a whistle.
Yeah, who gets to decide?
I get to decide when it comes to Bigfoot.
Okay.
Just like the pluralization of Bigfoot, I get to decide.
You get to decide.
It's Bigfoot, like deer.
Yeah, that seems to make sense.
It's not big feet.
No.
It's not Bigfoots.
Mm-hmm. Did we ever do an episode on the group of people that were circus performers that were referred to as like the Ohio Bigfoot girl or the other Bigfoot?
No, we did not. Nor did we do one on Rachel Bond, by the way. Several people have messaged and said, no, you never did an episode on Rachel Bond.
Okay.
And they want to hear it.
All right.
They requested.
York sad sack, Emily Dickinson.
They've requested that you do an episode on Rachel. That's all you.
Okay.
That's your baby. So.
Yeah.
All right. That's enough for tonight. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with more Strange Familiars. Strange Familiars is a production of
Dark Holler Arts.
Intro and background music is by
Stone Breath.
If you want to hear more or purchase music, you can go to stonebreath.bandcamp.com. Strange Familiars is on
Bandcamp? Podbean? The internet?
We haven't been on Podbean in years.
I don't know. I was like, I like to be prepared for questions, and you just were throwing me. I'm like, wait.
We're on Facebook.
Oh, okay.
Because we're old.
Yeah.
Facebook.com/Strange Familiars. You can join the Strange Familiars gathering group there. We're on Instagram as well.
Not Friendster.
At At Strange Familiars, one word, no underscore on Instagram. Follow us and make me feel like an influencer. Because
You're not on AOL?
Oh, I'm on AOL. My screen name is like 75 numbers.
No, that's CompuServe.
Oh, whatever.
Remember when the cool kids only had the...
Yeah, they all had like, yeah, and they were like, oh, you're not cool like us.
You don't have a CompuServe email? I can give you an invitation, but I only have 3, and I've promised them to 7 people.
Who are much cooler
Who are much cooler than you, so you're actually not even on the list. Sorry.
And, you know, strangefamiliars.com all the time. For merch, strangefamiliars.com/merch.
Heat through blasting